Margaret Hargrove did not lower her voice when she wanted to humiliate someone. That was the point. She stood in the middle of the Millhaven market on a Tuesday morning with her gloves still on and her chin lifted just enough to make sure everyone nearby could hear every word she was about to say. "That woman," she announced, not looking at Wren directly, but making it perfectly clear who she meant, "has been selling out of a cart with no permit, no license, and no husband to answer for her debts. Someone ought to report her before she poisons half the county." Wren Calloway was 3 feet away. She heard every word. She kept her hands moving, kept arranging the jars on her table, kept her face from doing anything Margaret could use against her later. But her hands were shaking. She had not eaten that morning. She had not eaten much the morning before either. There were 7 jars of blackberry preserves on the table in front of her, and every single one of them had to sell, or she would not make rent on the room she'd been sleeping in since the bank took the house. She had been standing at this market since before dawn, and the morning had been slow. And now Margaret Hargrove was telling half of Millhaven not to buy from her. This is the moment that changed everything. Not because Wren fought back, not because she said something brave, but because she didn't. Because she stood there and took it, same as she'd been taking things for the past 2 years, and something in her chest went very quiet in a way that was more frightening than anger. If you've ever been that close to the edge and still had to smile, you already know what kind of courage that takes. If that moment speaks to you, stay with this story. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The market at Millhaven happened every Tuesday and Friday on the wide flat stretch of packed earth between the feed store and the livery. By 8 in the morning, it was already loud with people. Ranchers selling eggs and dried corn, a few women with quilts folded over their arms, a man from the valley who came every week with a wagon of potatoes that were always slightly too soft, but which everyone bought anyway because he had 7 children and nobody wanted to be the one who didn't buy his potatoes. Wren had been coming here for 8 months. She'd started the week after the bank sent its final notice. She'd gone through everything in the house first. The furniture, the good dishes, the tools she couldn't use herself. She'd sold what she could, moved into a single room at the back of Mrs. Pelham's boarding house, and started cooking because it was the one thing she knew how to do that people would actually pay for. Preserves, pickled vegetables. 2 kinds of fruit butter when she could afford the sugar. She kept her prices reasonable because she knew the people who might buy from her were not people with a great deal of extra money, and because she needed them to come back. It was not a living. It was a way to keep from dying, which she'd decided was going to have to be enough for now. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone for 2 years. He'd died of a fever in March, which was one of the crueler months to lose someone because March looks like it might become something hopeful and then doesn't. They hadn't had children. They hadn't had much, honestly. Thomas was a good man who worked hard and couldn't quite seem to get ahead, and Wren had loved him in the practical way you love someone you've built a life with, someone whose habits you've learned to work around, someone whose absence leaves a shape in your days that you keep bumping into. She didn't talk about grieving. She didn't think of herself as a widow in the dramatic sense, black veil, pale face, weeping into handkerchiefs. She thought of herself as a woman trying to figure out what came next, which was less poetic but more accurate. What Margaret Hargrove had against her, Wren had never been entirely sure. Margaret was one of those women who had decided early on that her position in a town required constant maintenance, like a fence line. You had to walk it regularly and repair any place where someone else's prosperity might be creeping through. Wren's offense, as far as she could tell, was existing in a way that Margaret hadn't approved. No family name worth mentioning, no man to attach her respectability to, and now the nerve to set up at the market and earn money without asking anyone's permission. The morning Margaret made her announcement, Wren had sold exactly 2 jars. She kept her eyes down after Margaret moved away, kept straightening things that didn't need straightening. The woman 2 tables over, a farmer's wife named Dora, who sold smoked sausages, caught Wren's eye for just a second and gave her a small, pained look that meant something like, "I'm sorry that happened, and I'm not going to say anything about it, because I can't afford to either." Wren understood. She nodded once and looked away. That was when she noticed the boy. He was standing at the edge of the market, not in it exactly, but close enough that he was getting jostled by people passing through. He looked about 7 or 8, dark-haired, wearing a coat that was too warm for the morning. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was just there. Still in a way that children almost never were in crowds, which was the first thing that caught her attention. The second thing was that nobody around him seemed to notice him at all. People moved past him, around him, through the space where he stood, and not a single one of them looked at him. Wren watched him for a moment, then she watched a little longer. 2 boys her nephew's age came running through the market chasing something, a ball or maybe just each other, and one of them nearly knocked into the still boy, pulled up short, looked at him, and then said something to his friend that made them both laugh as they ran on. The still boy didn't react. He didn't move at all. He just stood there while people kept pushing past him. And the longer Wren watched, the more she understood that standing there unmoving was not stubbornness or strangeness. It was the only thing he knew how to do that kept him safe. She had felt that way herself, not so long ago. She left her table, which meant leaving her jars unattended, which she couldn't really afford to do, but she left them anyway, and walked to where the boy was standing. She didn't approach him straight on. She came at an angle, stopped a few feet away, and looked out at the market the same direction he was looking, as if they were both watching the same thing. "That man sells the worst potatoes in the county," she said, nodding toward the wagon man. "But nobody can bring themselves to stop buying them. I think it's the children." The boy said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. "I'm Wren," she said. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask if he was lost or if he needed help or if he was all right, which were the things adults always asked children and which always felt like demands wrapped in kindness. She just said her name and left some room. She found out later his name was Elias Vane. She found out that everyone in Millhaven knew who he was. She found out that he hadn't spoken in 3 years. But she didn't know any of that yet. She just knew that this child was standing alone in a crowd, that nobody was looking at him, and that he was holding himself very carefully still the way a person does when they've learned that moving draws attention, and attention is dangerous. She knew that because she'd done the same thing, once. Still did, some mornings. "I have blackberry preserves at my table," she said, still looking at the market instead of at him. "The kind with chunks, not smooth. My aunt used to say smooth preserves were just jam that couldn't commit to anything." She paused. "You don't have to come if you don't want to. I'm just mentioning it." She waited one more beat, then turned and walked back to her table. She heard a few minutes later the sound of small feet on packed earth, stopping a careful distance away. She didn't look up. Gideon Mercer had been in the market since 7 in the morning looking for his son. He wasn't panicking. He had learned, over the past 3 years, not to panic, at least not visibly, because panic made Elias freeze harder, and the last time he'd frozen hard enough, it had taken 4 hours and a lot of sitting on the floor of whatever room they were in before Gideon had been able to get him to move again. So he was walking fast, yes, and his jaw was set in a way that his ranch hands recognized as meaning something was wrong, but he was not panicking. He had thought Elias was in the wagon. He had turned around to help old Harlan off the step, and by the time he'd turned back, the boy was gone. This happened. It happened more than Gideon liked to admit. Elias would fix on something, a sound sometimes, or a direction, or some invisible pull that Gideon could never identify from the outside, and simply move toward it without warning, without checking if anyone was watching, without any apparent awareness that a 7-year-old alone in a market crowd was a situation that made his father's chest feel like it was being compressed by a very large hand. He moved through the market the way he moved through most things these days, efficiently, with the minimum necessary communication, scanning as he went. People nodded at him. A few tried to say something. Gideon was known here. His family had ranched this land for 30 years, but he moved past the attempts. Not rude exactly, just not available. He found Elias near the table with the preserves. The boy was standing a few feet back from it, which was closer than he usually got to strangers and their things, which was the first thing that made Gideon stop instead of simply crossing the space between them and taking his son's hand. The second thing was the woman behind the table. She wasn't performing for Elias. She wasn't doing any of the things that people did when they encountered his son in public. The crouching down to eye level, the exaggerated friendliness, the slightly desperate brightness in their voices that children and dogs could always hear and always distrusted. She was just sitting there doing her work, occasionally saying something in a plain and conversational way, not waiting for a response, not watching him with the particular kind of watchful hope that Gideon had come to recognize and hate, because it always made Elias shut down completely. She was talking about potatoes. Gideon stood at the edge of the aisle and watched. He had taken Elias to 4 different doctors in the past 3 years. The first one had told him that the boy was traumatized and that time would heal it. The second one had told him that the boy needed to be in a specialized facility, which Gideon had refused so immediately that the doctor had taken a step back. The third had given him a list of things to try: specific exercises, specific ways of speaking, a careful management of the environment. And none of them had made any difference. The fourth had been kind and honest. He said he wasn't sure. He said sometimes children went silent and came back on their own timeline, and there wasn't much to be done except not make it worse. The problem was that Gideon kept making it worse. He didn't mean to, but he would see Elias standing alone, not speaking, staring at nothing, and something in him would reach its limit and he would push. Just a little, just ask for something, just try to get the boy to respond. And Elias would go somewhere further inside himself that Gideon couldn't follow. The woman at the table said something about a jar. She slid it a few inches in Elias's direction without looking at him directly. The boy looked at the jar. He reached out and touched it with 2 fingers, very lightly, and didn't pick it up. The woman went back to what she was doing. Gideon realized he was holding his breath. He let it out slowly and walked across the aisle. The woman looked up when he approached, and for a second he saw her register him, his size, his expression, the way he was looking at Elias. And then she went back to looking at her table. "He's yours?" she said. "He is. He's been here about 20 minutes. He didn't wander in confused, if that's what you're worried about. He came deliberate." "He does that," Gideon said. "I'm sorry if he was any trouble." "He wasn't," she said. "He's not." Gideon looked at Elias. The boy was still looking at the jar. "Elias," he said, and kept his voice carefully level. "Come on. We need to get back." Elias didn't move, not the frozen kind of not moving. Gideon knew the difference now, could feel it like a change in air pressure. This was just choosing not to yet, which was, in its own way, more startling. "It's all right," the woman said, still not looking up. "He can stay a minute if he wants." Gideon looked at her. "He doesn't talk," he said. He said it the way he'd learned to say it, flat and forward, because the sooner people knew, the sooner they could stop waiting for something that wasn't coming. "He hasn't in 3 years. She nodded. "I know. I mean, I didn't know, but I could tell." She finally looked up at him. She had a direct kind of gaze, not challenging, but not shrinking either. "I wasn't expecting him to." There was a sound behind Gideon. A group of older boys moving through the market, laughing about something. One of them noticed Elias and elbowed his friend. "Hey, look, it's the mute kid." His friend snickered. "Hey, say something. Can you even hear us? Maybe he's deaf too." Gideon turned, already moving, his voice coming out low and hard. "Walk away." The boys scattered. When he turned back, the woman was looking at Elias, not at the retreating boys, not at Gideon. The boy had gone very still in a different way. The wrong way. "Hey," the woman said quietly. Not to Gideon, to Elias. "That kind of thing, people saying garbage because they've got nothing better to do. That's on them, not you." Elias didn't respond, but he didn't move away either. Gideon stood there and watched a woman he'd never met say the right thing to his son, without trying to make it into a lesson, or a comfort, or anything that required a response. She just said it and let it sit. He didn't know her name yet. "Wren Calloway," she said, without him asking, which meant she'd noticed him staring. She extended her hand across the table. "Gideon Mercer," he said, and shook it. Her grip was firm. There was a small scar on the back of her left hand, the kind you got from a kitchen accident years ago and stopped thinking about. "I know who you are," she said. "Your family built half the east fence line." "That was my father." "Still," She looked back at Elias. He's a careful boy. He watches things before he decides about them. Gideon looked at his son. Yeah, he said. He does. There was a beat of silence that wasn't exactly comfortable, but wasn't as uncomfortable as it should have been with two people who didn't know each other. If you ever need someone to sit with him, the woman said, still looking at Elias. Not a nurse, not a doctor, just someone who doesn't need him to be anything in particular. I'm available. Gideon looked at her. He waited for the angle, the pitch, the request for money, the reason behind the offer. It didn't come. Why? He said. She considered this. Because I know what it looks like when someone is waiting for things to be quiet enough to feel safe, and I don't have anywhere to be. She finally looked at him. Also, those jars aren't selling, and I could use the work. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in months, maybe longer. He didn't say yes that day. He said he'd think about it, which was what he said when he meant yes, but wasn't ready to commit to it yet. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. It was always quiet, but Gideon had learned to read the quality of Elias's silences the way you learn to read weather. There were different kinds, and they meant different things. The silence on the ride home was not the closed kind. It was more like the boy was still somewhere back at the market, still thinking about something. He reached into his coat pocket about halfway home and took out the jar of blackberry preserves. Gideon stared at the road ahead. He hadn't seen Elias take it. He hadn't seen him pay for it either, which meant the woman had given it to him, or Elias had simply picked it up. He would need to go back and pay for it. That was the practical thought. The other thought, the one he didn't quite let himself have fully, was that his son had wanted something badly enough to take it, which was more wanting than he'd seen from the boy in a long time. That evening, after supper that Elias barely touched, and a bath that Gideon managed to get him through without incident, he sat at the kitchen table while the boy slept and thought about the woman at the market. Wren Calloway. Widow, selling preserves because she had nothing else to sell. He thought about the way she'd talked to Elias, or, more accurately, the way she'd talked near him. Like his silence was not a problem to be solved, but simply a feature of the landscape you learn to account for. His ranch hands were good men, most of them. They were kind to Elias in the awkward way of people who had no idea what to do with a child who didn't speak. They kept out of his way, mostly, which was a kindness but also a kind of erasure. The housekeeper, Mrs. Grady, was efficient and not unkind, but Elias made her nervous in a way she couldn't hide, and children always knew when they made adults nervous. There wasn't anyone at the ranch who sat on the floor with Elias. There wasn't anyone who talked about potatoes. He wrote a note and gave it to one of the hands to take into town the next morning. The note said, "The offer still stands if yours does. We can talk terms. G. Mercer." He did not reread it before he handed it over because he knew if he reread it, he would second-guess it, and he was tired of second-guessing things that seemed obvious. Wren got the note at 11 in the morning. She read it twice, then folded it into her coat pocket and went back to the 2 jars she was trying to decide whether to put out at Friday's market or save for next week. She put them out. She told herself it was a practical decision. She told herself she hadn't made up her mind yet. She had made up her mind. Not about Gideon Mercer. She didn't know enough about him to make up her mind about anything, but about the boy, about Elias. She had been thinking about him since the market, about the specific way he'd stood, about the moment he'd touched the jar with 2 fingers and then pulled his hand back like he wasn't sure he was allowed to want things. She'd grown up with a cousin who was like that, not in the same way exactly, but in the way of children who had learned that wanting things led to disappointment and had decided it was safer to stop wanting. Her cousin had eventually grown into a man who was perfectly fine, mostly, but who still had a habit of pulling back from anything that mattered, just before it could matter too much. She hadn't wanted to watch it happen again. The reply she sent back said, "Friday. I'll come out Friday. Don't have anyone meet me at the road. I don't do well with formal introductions." It was, she realized after she sent it, a strange thing to write. True, but strange. She packed her things that Thursday night. 2 dresses, her aunt's cooking notes written on the back of old envelopes, her husband's watch, because she couldn't bring herself to sell it, even though she probably should have. She did not tell Mrs. Pelham she was leaving because Mrs. Pelham would ask questions, and she didn't have clean answers for any of them. She left the room key on the table with 2 weeks' back rent she couldn't quite cover, and a note that said she was sorry, and she walked out before sunrise on Friday. The Mercer Ranch was 7 miles east of Millhaven, which was far enough that the town's noise didn't reach it. She got a ride in the back of a grain wagon as far as the turnoff, then walked the last 2 miles on her own. She had expected the ranch to look like what it was, a working spread, functional, maybe a little worn the way things got when they were used hard and maintained by someone with more practical concerns than aesthetic ones. She hadn't expected it to look sad, but it did. Not broken down sad, not neglected. There was nothing falling apart. The fences were solid, the barn was well kept, and there were chickens moving around in a side yard in the disorganized way of healthy chickens. But there was something about the place that felt like it was holding its breath. She knocked at the front door. Gideon answered it himself. He looked like he hadn't slept well, which suggested he'd been thinking about this. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He stepped back to let her in. The house was clean but spare. Not because someone had cleared things out, she thought, but because things had never really been added. There were places where things should have been. A frame on the wall that held nothing. A table by the window with nothing on it. "Where is he?" she asked. "Kitchen." He paused. "He knows you're coming. I told him last night." "How'd he take it?" Gideon considered. He put his fork down and stared at the wall for a while. Then he picked his fork back up. "So, I don't know." "Okay," she said. "That's okay." She went to the kitchen. Elias was at the table with a piece of paper in front of him and a pencil in his hand. He was not drawing. He was holding the pencil and not drawing, which was either because he'd stopped or because he'd been waiting. Wren sat down across from him. She did not say hello, did not make her arrival into an event. "What are you drawing?" she asked. He didn't answer. "Or not drawing," she said. "That's fine too." She looked around the kitchen. There was a stove, a wood box, a shelf of provisions. Everything she needed. "I'm going to make breakfast," she said. "You want eggs?" "Nothing." "I'll make eggs," she said, and stood up and went to the stove. She scrambled 6 eggs because there were 3 of them, or maybe 4 if there was a ranch hand who hadn't eaten yet, and she toasted bread and found a small jar of someone's preserves in the back of a shelf. Not hers, something else. Peach, or maybe plum, and put that on the table. She worked the way she usually worked, which was without unnecessary noise or commentary, and she did not look at Elias while she was doing it, even though she was very aware of him the whole time. When she set the plate in front of him, he looked at it. Then he looked at her. Then he picked up his fork. Gideon came in from whatever he'd been doing outside and stopped in the doorway. She didn't look at him. "Sit down," she said. "Eggs will get cold." He sat down. They ate breakfast. Nobody talked. The kitchen was quiet in a way that wasn't quite the same as the sad quiet of the rest of the house. It wasn't fixed. Nothing was fixed. This was one breakfast in a house full of things that had been broken for a long time and were not going to become unbroken quickly. But Elias ate all his eggs, and when Wren got up to wash the dishes, she heard the pencil start moving on the paper. She kept her back turned and her hands in the water and let him have that, because some things needed room to happen without anyone watching. The pencil kept moving for the better part of an hour. Wren didn't look. She finished the dishes, dried her hands on a cloth that had seen better days, and found a loose hinge on one of the cabinet doors that she spent 20 minutes fixing with a screwdriver she located in a drawer full of miscellaneous hardware, the kind of drawer that accumulates in every household and which nobody ever sorts through because sorting through it would require making decisions about things that don't quite matter enough to decide about. She fixed the hinge. She wiped down the stovetop. She found a pot that had something burned into the bottom of it from a long time ago and set it soaking because whoever had tried to scrub it before had been going at it wrong. She did not look at Elias. By the time she turned around to refill her coffee cup, the paper was face down on the table and the boy was gone. She heard him on the stairs. Not running. Elias didn't run. She'd already noticed that. He moved carefully the way you moved when you'd learned that sudden movements attracted the wrong kind of attention. Just the quiet step, step, step of him going up. Gideon came in from outside about 10 minutes later, tracking mud that he stopped to pull his boots off about, which told her something. That there had been someone in this house who'd cared about the floors at some point, and that the habit had stuck even when the reason for it was gone. He looked at the empty table. He go up? Little while ago. Gideon looked at the stairs, then back at the kitchen, then at the pot soaking in the basin. You don't have to do all that. I know, she said. I'm doing it anyway. He pulled out a chair and sat down, not because he needed to sit, but because he didn't quite know where to put himself, which she recognized as a particular kind of discomfort, being in your own house and not being sure where you fit in it anymore. He took the paper with him, Gideon said. I noticed. He doesn't usually do that. He looked at his hands. Usually he leaves things where he makes them, doesn't seem to care if people see. Maybe he wasn't done, Wren said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was drawing when I told him you were coming, stopped right away. He paused again. When I came down this morning, he was already at the table with a new piece of paper, before sunrise. Wren didn't say anything. She understood what he was telling her, that Elias had been waiting in his way, which was a kind of hoping that the boy probably didn't have a name for and wouldn't have been able to articulate even if he'd been speaking. She understood it because she recognized it. You woke up early before things that mattered, even when you didn't let yourself believe they mattered. What do you need me to do? She asked. Gideon looked up. What do you mean? For him, I mean practically. What are the things that help and what are the things that don't? He blinked, like the directness of the question surprised him. Nobody's ever asked me that, he said. Well, I'm asking. He was quiet for a moment, gathering. Loud voices bother him, not just shouting, raised voices, even happy ones. He can tell the difference eventually, but at first it just registers as loud. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the table. He doesn't like being touched without warning. Not by most people. He tolerates it from me, but even then, I always make sure he can see my hand coming. He stopped. That sounds bad. It doesn't, she said. It sounds like you paid attention. I had to, he said. It took me a long time to figure out it was something I had to do. At first I kept trying to get him to come back to me, kept reaching for him, and it made everything worse. It took me about a year to stop doing that. A year of doing the wrong thing and knowing it was wrong and not being able to stop. She didn't say that. She just nodded. What else? She said. He likes things in the same place. If you move something in his room, he'll notice and it'll bother him until it's back. He won't say anything. He won't do anything, but you'll see it in how he holds himself. He paused. He likes mornings better than afternoons. Afternoons are harder. I don't know why. Does he eat all right? Some things, not much variety. He'll eat eggs, bread, oatmeal, anything with apples in it, most things from the garden if they're cooked soft. He won't touch meat most days. I don't know why that is either. He rubbed the back of his neck. There are a lot of things I don't know why. That's all right, she said. You don't need to know why everything. He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he recognized but wasn't fluent in. 3 years, he said. 3 years, and everybody I talk to wants to know the reason. The doctors want a reason. The county wants a reason. Margaret Hargrove has about 4 reasons she's decided on herself, none of which have anything to do with Elias. What does she want? His jaw tightened. She's been pushing the county board to place him. Says he belongs in a facility in Crestfield where they handle... He stopped. Used the word carefully, like it was something he had to handle. Children with difficulties. That's what she calls it. She has any standing to push something like that? Her husband's cousin sits on the county board. He looked out the window. So yeah, she has some standing. Wren set her coffee cup down. She thought about Margaret Hargrove at the market, the lifted chin, the voice that carried on purpose, the women who sharpened themselves against other people's misfortune and called it principle. Then we'd better make sure there's nothing to push against, she said. Gideon looked at her. You've been here 2 hours. I know, she said. I'm a fast reader. The first week was not easy, and she hadn't expected it to be. Elias avoided her systematically, which she came to understand was not personal, but architectural. He had built the habit of avoiding people who might leave, And the surest way not to be hurt by someone's absence was to not allow their presence in the first place. He would leave a room when she entered it. Not obviously, not dramatically. He would find a reason, a pencil he needed from another room, something he'd forgotten upstairs, and he would take himself out of the shared space with the efficiency of someone who had practiced the exit. She let him. She learned his schedule, when he woke, when he ate, when he went to his room, when he came back down. She made herself predictable, and she made herself quiet, which was something she'd always been good at, but which required a different kind of intention here. She was not quiet because she was disappearing. She was quiet because she was staying. There's a difference, and children know it even when they can't say it. The ranch hands were a different adjustment. There were 3 of them. Pete, who was maybe 50 and had been with the Mercers for 15 years, and who regarded Wren with the particular wariness of someone who has watched a household reorganize itself and is not sure yet which way things will fall. Davy, who was young and awkward around her in the way of young men who had no framework for a woman who was neither a wife nor a relation, nor someone to flirt with. And a man everyone called Cutter, origin of the name unclear, who had very little to say about anything and seemed to prefer it that way. None of them were unfriendly. None of them made a place for her either. Pete was the one who finally broke the silence about 4 days in, when they were both in the kitchen at the same time, and she was making bread, and he was looking for something in the provisions shelf with the focused expression of someone who has forgotten what they came in for. "You know what you're doing with him?" he said, not rudely, just directly. "With Elias?" "Yeah." She kept her hands in the dough. "Not entirely, but I know what I'm not doing, which I think is more useful right now." He considered this. "What aren't you doing?" "Trying to fix him," she said. Pete was quiet for a moment. He found whatever he'd been looking for, a tin of something, and turned to leave, then stopped. "He used to laugh," he said, before. He was a loud kid, always running, got into everything." He looked at the door rather than at her. "I keep forgetting what that sounded like." He left. She kept making the bread. Her hands were covered in flour, and she was not going to cry in a stranger's kitchen over something she couldn't change. But she stood there for a moment and just held that information. A loud kid who ran and got into everything, and felt the weight of what 3 years of silence did to a household. The shift happened on a Thursday. Not a dramatic shift. Nothing about Elias was dramatic. His changes came sideways, at an angle, in the way of things that could only be understood looking back at them. Wren had been hanging laundry in the side yard. The wind was good that day, a dry wind out of the west, when she heard a sound from the kitchen. Something falling. Not a crash, just a fall, a single object hitting the floor. She went inside. Elias was standing in the middle of the kitchen. He'd knocked a cup off the table. It hadn't broken. It was tin, one of the ranch's work cups. But it had made a sound, and the sound had done something to him. She recognized the state immediately. He was very still in the wrong way, not the careful still he usually practiced. This was different, rigid, the stillness of someone whose body had received information that it did not know how to process and had simply stopped while it tried. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance at approximately table height. He wasn't seeing anything in front of him. Mrs. Grady, the housekeeper, was at the other end of the kitchen. She'd come in from somewhere and was now standing with her hands half raised, the instinct to grab him and pull him back visible in every line of her body. "Don't," Wren said. Mrs. Grady looked at her. "Don't touch him," Wren said, and kept her voice level. "And don't talk to him. Just wait." "He looks like he's in there," Wren said. "He just needs it to be quiet." Mrs. Grady stood with her hands still half raised for another few seconds, then lowered them slowly. Wren crossed the kitchen at a careful angle, not toward Elias, but near him, the same angle she'd used at the market, and she sat down on the floor. Not on a chair. The floor. She sat with her back against the cabinet, her legs out in front of her, and she looked at the far wall. Not at Elias. She picked up the tin cup from where it had rolled and set it on the floor next to her, and she waited. Mrs. Grady made a small sound that might have been protest and might have been something else, and then left the kitchen. The kitchen was quiet. It stayed quiet for a while. Outside, she could hear the wind against the side of the house, Hear Cutter doing something with wood near the barn. Inside, nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of a house, the kind you stop hearing unless you're specifically listening. She wasn't counting time. She'd learned not to count time in situations like this because the counting made you tense and tension made things worse. She just sat. She thought about the bread she'd made, which had turned out slightly dense because she'd added the water too fast. She thought about the hinge on the cabinet door that she'd need to check again. She thought about the letter she should probably send to her cousin in Abilene, who didn't know where she was and was probably not worried but might be mildly curious. She was on her third thought about the bread when she heard a breath. Not a regular breath, a releasing one. She didn't look. She kept looking at the far wall. Elias sat down on the floor, not next to her. There was about 4 feet between them, which was a careful distance, a considered distance, the distance of someone who had decided to be close to something without committing fully to it. She understood that distance. She had stood at it herself at various points in her life. They sat on the floor together for maybe 20 minutes. Then Elias got up, collected his pencil from the table, and went upstairs. Wren got up, poured herself coffee, and stood at the window for a moment looking at the yard. She felt something in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Not triumph, that was the wrong word, and not relief exactly, though there was some of that. Something quieter. Something that felt like the beginning of a thing rather than the achievement of one. Gideon found out what had happened from Mrs. Grady, who told him that evening with the expression of someone who was not sure what they'd witnessed, but felt it was important to report it. He listened without saying much. After she'd gone, he stood in the kitchen for a while and looked at the spot on the floor where Mrs. Grady had indicated. He found Wren on the porch that night, after Elias was in bed, sitting with a cup of tea and the specific quietness of a person who had used up most of their energy for the day. He sat in the other chair, didn't say anything right away. "Mrs. Grady said you sat on the floor." "I did. For 20 minutes. Give or take." He was quiet. He hasn't done that, gone away like that, in a while. Usually, there's something I can identify afterward. Something loud, something unexpected. I try to prevent them. "You can't prevent all of them," she said. "I know." He turned the coffee cup he'd brought out with him. "Did you know it would work, sitting down like that?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I knew trying to pull him back wouldn't work. Beyond that, I was guessing." "That's what I've been doing for 3 years," he said. "Guessing." "Well," she said, "you've been guessing alone." He looked at her sideways. It was getting dark and his face was mostly shadow, but she caught the look. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. He didn't seem like a man who expressed gratitude easily. It was more like recognition, like she'd said a thing he already knew but hadn't heard out loud before. "You're nothing like I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He considered. "Someone more provisional. Someone ready to leave if it got difficult." "It's been difficult since Tuesday," she said. "That's what I mean," he said. She drank her tea. The night was cool and clear, and the stars over the ranch were the kind you only got this far from town, the kind that made the sky look like it had depth to it. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said. Not because it was relevant, but because she'd been carrying it around for a while and the night had the right quality for setting things down. "And after he died, I spent about 6 months doing a version of what Elias does. Not speaking, I could still speak, but going, away. Somewhere inside where things couldn't reach me." She paused. "Eventually you come back, but someone has to leave the door open for you." Gideon said nothing for a long moment. "Who left it open for you?" She thought about that. "My aunt. She'd come and just sit in the same room, didn't ask questions, didn't tell me to eat or to sleep or to pull myself together." She looked at the stars. She just made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. The chair creaked when Gideon shifted his weight. "I didn't know how to do that for him," he said. "I kept pulling. I thought if I could just get him to respond just once." He stopped. "Every time I did that, he went further away." "You were scared," she said. "Scared people grab." "Yeah," he said very quietly. "They do." She finished her tea and stood up. "He's going to start trusting this place," she said. When he does, he might get harder before he gets easier. When people feel safe enough to feel things, the things aren't always quiet. Gideon looked up at her. In the dark, she could see that he understood exactly what she was saying. "All right," he said, "just so you know." She went inside. She heard him sit out there for a while longer before he came in. She was already in the small room off the kitchen she'd been given, barely bigger than a closet, but private, when she heard his boots on the stairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle. The second week, Elias started leaving things, not for her specifically, or not in a way that he would have acknowledged was for her. He left them in places she would find them, which was close enough. The first one was a small drawing on the kitchen table one morning, pushed to the side near where she sat. She almost moved it without looking at it. Then she looked at it. It was the market. She recognized the layout, the tables, the rough shape of the livery in the background. There were two figures near a table. One of them was taller and one was small. The tall one had something in her hand that might have been a jar. She left the drawing exactly where it was. 2 days later, there was another one left on the step going to her room. She picked it up carefully. This one was the kitchen, and there were 3 people at the table, and under the table someone had drawn a cat that wasn't there, which made her wonder if there had been a cat before, or if he simply wanted one. She set that one on the small shelf above her bed. She was careful not to make anything of the drawings in front of him. She didn't thank him for them or acknowledge them as gifts. But once, passing through the kitchen when he was at the table with his pencil, she stopped beside him and looked at what he was working on. A horse, detailed in a way that showed he'd really looked at horses. The way the muscles sat along the neck, the particular angle of a knee. And she said, "That's a good horse," and moved on. He didn't react. But the next morning, there was a drawing of a horse left on the kitchen table. A different horse, more finished than the one she'd seen. She recognized the neck, the angle of the knee. She thought about what Gideon had said. He used to be a loud kid who got into everything. And she looked at the horse drawing and thought, he's still getting into everything, just quietly, just in the language he has left. Margaret Hargrove came to the ranch on a Wednesday. Wren didn't know she was coming. Nobody had been told, which was probably the point. Margaret arrived in a proper buggy with a woman named Cecily Dowd, who sat very straight and wrote things in a small notebook, and they were halfway up the drive before Pete saw them from the barn and came to find Gideon, who was in the middle of fixing a section of the east fence. Gideon got to the house just as Wren was opening the door. He was still holding the fence tool he'd been working with. He looked at Margaret Hargrove on his porch, and then at Wren, and for a second something moved across his face that might have been the specific anger of a man who has been ambushed in his own home and doesn't want to show it in front of witnesses. "Margaret," he said, his voice was even. "Gideon." She looked past him at Wren. "I heard you'd taken on some help. I thought I'd come and see how Elias is getting on." The way she said it, some help, had a specific texture to it, like the title was diminishing something on purpose. "He's getting on fine," Gideon said. "You could have sent word." "I was in the area." She looked at Cecily. "Cecily is with the county welfare office. She's been checking in on several families in the region." She said it casually, as if this were simply a thing that happened. Wren looked at the woman with the notebook. Cecily looked back at her with the expression of someone who had been put in an awkward position and was not going to acknowledge that it was awkward. "He's upstairs," Wren said. "He's usually resting this time of day." "I'd love to see him," Margaret said. She smiled. It did not reach her eyes. Gideon looked at Wren for just a second, a fraction of a second, barely anything, and she understood what it meant. He wanted to send them away. He couldn't send them away because Cecily Dowd had a county title and a notebook. If he sent them away, it would look like something to hide. "I'll go get him," Wren said. She went upstairs. Elias was in his room with his drawings spread around him, which was not resting but was what she'd said because she needed time to think. She crouched at the door rather than going in. She had learned not to go into his room without giving him a moment with the idea of it first. "There are some people downstairs," she said, keeping her voice the same as always. "They want to see you. You don't have to talk to them. You just have to be there for a few minutes." She paused. "I'll be right next to you the whole time." He looked at her. Not the way he sometimes looked past her. She actually looked at her for a moment. Then he started putting his drawings face down. Not all of them. He was specific about it. Certain ones face down, others left where they were. She watched him do it and understood that he was deciding which parts of himself to protect. He stood up and followed her to the door. Downstairs, Margaret Hargrove's expression when Elias appeared was one of those carefully assembled expressions that looked like concern and felt like inventory. She looked at him the way a person looks at evidence. "Hello, Elias," she said, and her voice went up in that way voices did with children, that particular softening that adults mistook for kindness and children frequently experienced as condescension. Elias stood next to Wren's left shoulder and looked at the middle distance. "He seems thin," Margaret said to Gideon, as if Elias were not present. "He's always been lean," Gideon said. Cecily wrote something. "I understand," Margaret said, still addressing Gideon, "that this arrangement has been in place for 2 weeks. Has there been any progress?" The word landed like a stone in water. Wren felt Elias shift his weight, just slightly, a half-inch change in how he was standing. She knew that shift. It was what happened when he felt himself being talked about rather than talked to. She moved, equally slightly, so that her arm was just close enough to his shoulder to be felt without quite touching him. "He's doing well," Gideon said. "Gideon," Margaret's voice took on its patient, sorry to have to say this quality. "You know I care about this child. We all do. But a woman with no credentials, no training, no formal—" "I make him breakfast," Wren said. Everyone looked at her. She kept her voice calm. "Every morning. And I know he takes his eggs without pepper because pepper bothers him. And I know he draws better in the morning than the afternoon. And I know that the third drawer in the kitchen sticks and makes a sharp sound when you pull it. And so I don't pull that drawer in the morning because morning is when he's most available." She paused. "What are Mrs. Dowd's credentials, and does she know any of that?" Cecily stopped writing. Margaret's smile went very thin. "This isn't about you, Mrs. Calloway." "No," Wren agreed. "It's about him." She looked at Cecily. "And he's standing right here." Elias was still looking at the middle distance, but she felt his shoulder, the one nearest her arm, very slightly, not lean, barely a millimeter, press in her direction. She noticed it. She kept her face neutral. She kept looking at Cecily. The visit ended in the way of visits that cannot quite achieve their objective. A little too much politeness, a few more notes in a notebook, a departure that had no good exit line. Margaret said she'd be in touch. Gideon said he was sure she would be. They were both saying something underneath those words that neither of them was going to say in front of witnesses. When the buggy had gone down the drive and out of sight, Gideon stood on the porch and stared at the road for a long moment. Pete had appeared from somewhere and was watching the dust settle with an expression that suggested he'd been listening from the barn. Elias had gone back upstairs. Gideon came in and sat down at the kitchen table. He put his elbows on it and his face in his hands for a second, which was the most undone she'd seen him look. "She's going to send the county board," he said. "She's going to say she saw what she came here to see, and they're going to send someone official." "Then we'll be ready for them," Wren said. He looked up at her. "You keep saying things like that." "Because they keep being true." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was tired, and it was a little bit fond, and it was the most human thing she'd heard from him since she arrived. "What do we do?" he said. "Same thing we've been doing," she said. "Take care of him. Document what he can do, not what he can't. And stop letting Margaret Hargrove be the loudest voice in the room." She paused. "The notebook works both ways. We can keep our own." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Dealt with people like her." "Not this specifically," she said. "But people who decide they know what's best for someone they've spent about 10 minutes with? Yeah, I've dealt with that." He nodded slowly. He looked out toward the stairs, toward wherever Elias was, toward the room where a boy was turning his drawings face down because he'd learned that what he felt was something people wanted to assess. "He pressed against your arm," Gideon said quietly. "When she was talking, I saw it." Wren said nothing. "He hasn't—" Gideon stopped, pressed his lips together. "He hasn't reached toward anyone since his mother." The kitchen was very quiet. I know, she said, even though she hadn't known, not the full weight of it. She knew now. She let the silence hold what it needed to hold. Outside, the afternoon wind was picking up. She could hear it in the eaves, the particular sound of a working ranch settling into its afternoon rhythms. Horses, the far sound of something being hammered, the dry rustle of the cottonwood by the water trough. She thought about the drawings turned face down upstairs. She thought about what it meant to protect the parts of yourself that you most needed someone to see. She went to put the kettle on because that was something she could do, and because some things needed to be done even when there was no good way to answer them. The notebook Wren started was a plain thing, a ledger she'd found in the bottom of a trunk in the supply room, the first 30 pages already used for cattle counts from 4 years back. She tore those pages out carefully and started from the beginning. She didn't call it anything. She didn't write a title at the top. She just started recording what she saw. October 4th, morning. Elias came down before anyone else. Found him at the kitchen table with the cat drawing he'd done last week, the one with the imaginary cat. He'd added detail to it overnight. The cat now had a collar with something hanging from it, too small for me to make out. Ate a full bowl of oatmeal without prompting. Didn't leave the room when Pete came in for coffee, which is new. Pete didn't say anything to him, just nodded, and Elias nodded back. It lasted about 2 seconds, but it happened. She wrote in the evenings, after Elias was upstairs, at the small desk in her room with a candle because the lamp in there had a loose wick she hadn't gotten around to fixing. She wrote in plain sentences, nothing interpretive, just what she saw. What he ate, what he drew. When he left a room and when he didn't. The precise small measurements of a life that everyone else was recording in terms of what was missing from it. Gideon asked her about it once, saw the notebook open on the desk when he was passing her room with a question about something in the kitchen. "What's that?" "Record," she said. He looked at it. "Of what?" "Of what he does. Not what he doesn't do, what he does." He was quiet for a moment. "You think that'll matter to the county board?" "I think when someone comes here to decide whether my being here helps him, I want to have something in my hand that isn't an opinion," she said. "Margaret's got opinions. What I've got is dates and details." He looked at the notebook a moment longer. Then he said, "The lamp wick. There's a spare in the second drawer of the workbench in the barn, not the one that sticks." He left. She found the wick the next morning and fixed the lamp and wrote the evening's entry with better light. Elias gave her the ribbon on a Thursday, which was 3.5 weeks after she'd arrived. She didn't know what it was at first. She came downstairs to find him standing at the kitchen table with something held in both hands in front of him, and when she got closer she saw it was a piece of pale blue ribbon, frayed at both ends, soft with age. He was holding it the way you hold something you've carried a long time, with the specific, careful looseness of a person who has held it so many times the grip is automatic. He held it out to her. She stopped. She looked at his face. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at somewhere between her and the table, which was how he did things that cost him effort. She looked at the ribbon. "That's very pretty," she said, because it was, and because she could see it had been. He didn't move. The ribbon stayed extended. She reached out and took it from him, not quickly. She let her hand come in slowly so he could track it, the way Gideon had told her he needed. She took the ribbon and held it carefully. "Thank you," she said. He turned and went back upstairs. She stood in the kitchen holding the ribbon for a long moment. Then she set it on the shelf above her bed, next to the horse drawing he'd left for her the second week. She didn't ask Gideon about it that day. She waited until evening when Elias was in bed and she could hear from the silence that he was actually sleeping before she came and found Gideon at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger. "He gave me a ribbon this morning," she said. Gideon looked up. He went very still in a way that reminded her sharply of his son. "Pale blue?" he said. "Yes." He looked back at the ledger. He set the pen down in a way that was too careful, too deliberate. "That was Clara's," he said. "His mother. She wore it in her hair sometimes. The day she died, He stopped. "He found it in her things after. When I packed up her room, he took it. I didn't try to get it back. It was the first thing he'd reached for after she died." The kitchen was very quiet. "He's kept it for 3 years?" she said. Never put it down that I saw. He pressed the heels of his hands against the edge of the table. He sleeps with it, slept with it. I noticed last week he wasn't holding it at night, and I thought he'd lost it somewhere, and I didn't know how that would go. When a kid loses the one thing... He stopped again. She understood why he'd stopped. There wasn't a clean way to finish that sentence. He didn't lose it, she said. No, Gideon said. He gave it to you. She didn't have an answer to that. She wasn't sure one was needed. She was thinking about what it meant to give away the thing you'd held through 3 years of silence, not as a discarding, but as a placing, a decision about where something belonged now. What do I do with it? She asked. Gideon looked at her. His expression was complicated in the way of men who have learned not to let their expressions get complicated. I don't know, he said honestly. But I don't think you put it back. She nodded once and went to bed, and she lay there thinking about a boy who had walked downstairs with his most important thing held in both hands and decided she could be trusted with it. The county letter arrived on a Monday. Gideon read it standing on the porch, then brought it inside and set it on the table without comment. Wren read it while he made coffee, which he needed to do with his hands. The letter was from a man named Aldous Ritter, described as an appointed representative of the Harlan County Welfare Board. It said, in the specific language of official letters that meant to sound neutral while not being neutral at all, that there had been a concern raised regarding the welfare of a minor child residing at the Mercer Ranch, and that an investigative visit would be conducted at the end of the following week. It said that the board had an obligation to ensure appropriate care arrangements were in place. It used the word appropriate 3 times. Margaret didn't waste any time, Wren said. She never does. She set the letter down. She looked at the date of the visit. 9 days. Tell me about Ritter, she said. Gideon poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down. Aldous Ritter. He's been with the board about 4 years. He's not a bad man, I don't think, but he's careful in the way of men who want to keep their positions, and the person who raised the concern has her husband's cousin on the board, and careful men know which way the current runs. Does he have children? Gideon blinked. Why? Because men who have children and men who don't have children see child welfare differently. Not always, but often. He's got 2, grown now. That's something. She picked up the letter again. What's the facility in Crestfield like? Gideon's jaw tightened. I've never been. I've talked to one man whose brother was placed there as a boy. He said it was clean, well run by the standards of the time, but it was designed for children nobody wanted to deal with. The assumption was that they'd never return to a normal life. He paused. I won't let that happen. I know, she said. I mean it. I know you mean it, she said. And I want to make sure we prove it in writing, not just by saying it. She spent that day and the next 2 organizing what she'd been recording. She went back through the notebook and added dates she remembered from the first week before she'd started writing things down. She was specific about what she wrote. Not he seemed happier, but he sat in the same room for 30 minutes while I worked without leaving. Not he trusts me, but he extended his hand to accept something I offered without recoiling. She numbered the pages. Gideon watched her do this over 2 evenings. On the 3rd evening, he sat down across from her and said, What do you need from me? Tell me about before, she said. Before I came. Everything you tried. He talked for over an hour. She wrote as he talked, the doctors, the approaches, the specific failures that he described with the flat precision of someone who has gone over them so many times they've lost the worst of their edges. She wrote all of it down because context mattered. You couldn't show progress without showing where the start point was. At one point he said, I used to try to make him talk, not force him, just encourage. Keep asking questions, keep trying to get him to respond. One of the doctors said engagement was important. He stopped. It just scared him worse. She kept writing. When did you stop? About 6 months after it started, when I realized I was doing it for me, not him. He looked at his hands. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to know he was still... He stopped again. So I kept asking, and every time I asked, I could see him go a little further away. And I couldn't stop anyway, because the silence was worse than anything. She set the pen down. And then? And then I ran out of doctors, and I ran out of ideas, and I sat in that kitchen one night, and I looked at him sleeping in his chair. He used to fall asleep downstairs sometimes. I don't know why he stopped. And I just told him I was sorry. Not for anything specific, just in general. Just that I was sorry he was hurting and I didn't know how to help, and I was sorry I kept making it worse. He paused. He wasn't awake for it. He didn't hear me, but it was the first time I'd said it out loud. Wren was quiet for a moment. Write that down, she said. He looked up. Why? Because Ritter needs to understand that you see what went wrong, not just what you're doing right. Anyone can tell an inspector what they're doing right. Showing what you learned from doing it wrong, that's harder to dismiss. He took the pen she offered him. He wrote for a few minutes, slowly, in the hand of someone who was choosing words with more care than came naturally. She read what he'd written after he passed it back. It was not polished. It was not the kind of writing that sounded like it had been prepared for an audience. It sounded like what it was, a man saying a true thing in his own voice. Good, she said. He looked faintly surprised by that. Elias noticed something was happening. She wasn't sure how. She and Gideon had been careful not to discuss the letter in front of him, careful not to let the preparation for Ritter's visit change the rhythm of the house in obvious ways. But he was a boy who paid close attention to the temperature of rooms, to the particular quality of adult silences, and something had reached him. He started drawing differently. Not less, more. He was filling pages now where before he'd been careful with paper, almost rationing it, and the drawings were changing. She noticed it over the course of a week, the way you notice a season changing. Not one morning, but in accumulation. The earlier drawings had been precise, controlled, technically skilled in the way of a child who had taught himself by looking hard. These new ones were more urgent, less careful about the edges. She found one on the kitchen table one afternoon that stopped her. It was her. Not a flattering portrait. He wasn't drawing for flattery. He was drawing what he saw, which meant she had the slightly too wide jaw she'd always had, and the set to her shoulders that Thomas had once described as ready for something, which she'd taken as a compliment, and he'd probably meant as an observation. She was sitting down. She was looking at something off the page. In the drawing's background, visible through what appeared to be a window, there was a figure on horseback. Gideon, she thought, from the build and the particular way the figure held the reins. The drawing was the kitchen, the ranch, the two of them present in the same space. She stood there looking at it for a while. Then she turned it over and wrote on the back, very small in the corner, October 19th, Elias, for Wren. She didn't know what it meant exactly. She just wanted there to be a record that it had happened, that he had seen her and put what he saw on paper on this specific day. She put it in the notebook. Gideon started coming undone around day 6. She noticed it in small ways first, the way he was sleeping badly, which she could tell because he was at the kitchen table before 5 a.m. twice that week, not doing anything, just sitting. The way he answered questions one beat too slow, like he was listening to something else underneath the conversation. The way he watched Elias at meals with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. On the 7th night, she came downstairs to find him on the porch again, and she made 2 cups of coffee without asking and brought one out and sat in the other chair and waited. He took the coffee. He didn't say anything for a few minutes. If they take him, he said finally, they won't. But if they do, he looked at the dark. I don't know what happens. I don't know who I am if... He stopped, tried again. He's the only person in my life that I haven't... Another stop. She waited. I've pushed everyone away, he said. After Clara. I didn't mean to. I just needed things to be manageable, and people aren't manageable. And so I kept reducing, kept narrowing, and then it was just him and me and this ranch, and at least that... He looked at the coffee cup. At least that I could keep from getting smaller. She thought about that, about what it looked like from the outside. This man on this ranch, the contracted world he'd built around himself and his son, the careful reduction of everything that might hurt into things that simply couldn't leave. You didn't push me away, she said. He looked at her. I thought about it. When? First week. He was honest about it, which she appreciated. You sat on the floor with him and I watched it from the doorway and I thought, if he gets used to her, if he starts needing her, and she leaves, I've done this to him again. I've let something in that he's going to lose. So you thought about sending me away before that could happen? Yeah. But you didn't. No. He looked back at the dark. Because he touched that jar at your table, in the market, and I hadn't seen him want anything in so long that I couldn't. He didn't finish that. She sat with it. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the corral, and somewhere further out, a nightbird was being persistent about something. I'm not going to leave over this, she said. Over Ritter, over Margaret Hargrove, over the county board. He was quiet. I'm telling you now so you can stop calculating it, she said. I see you doing it. You're sitting here deciding how much to hope and leaving a margin in case I disappoint you. And I understand why you do that. But you should know that I'm aware of it, and I'm telling you straight. I'm not going anywhere because someone sends a letter. He turned and looked at her. Really looked, not the sideways glances he usually deployed. Why not? He said. You could. You've got no obligation here. I've got Elias's ribbon on my shelf, she said. That's an obligation. Something moved in his face. She couldn't quite name it. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't that kind of moment. And she wasn't sure either of them was ready for that kind of moment. And she wasn't even thinking along those lines yet. It was something simpler and harder. It was the look of a man who had reduced his world down to things that couldn't leave and had just been told, by a woman who could leave, that she wasn't planning to. Okay, he said after a while. Okay, she said. They finished their coffee. She went inside first. He stayed on the porch a little longer, and she heard from her room the sounds of him eventually coming in and going up to check on Elias. She recognized the particular sequence of his footsteps, the pause outside his son's room, before he went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about what she'd said. She turned it over. She checked it for the places where it might not be true. She couldn't find any. What? Aldous Ritter arrived on a Friday. He was a compact man in his 50s with a gray beard trimmed very short and the habit of looking around a room when he entered it, not in the suspicious way, but in the way of someone taking inventory from long practice. He arrived alone, which surprised Wren. She'd expected Margaret Hargrove or Cecily Dowd at minimum. He arrived without ceremony and declined the offer of coffee with a politeness that suggested he declined all hospitality on visits like this as a matter of policy. He had a folder. She didn't let herself look at what was in it. Gideon showed him the house. Wren followed at the kind of distance that said, I'm here without saying I'm anxious, which she was, but which she'd decided not to be visible about. Elias was upstairs, aware that someone was in the house. She'd told him last night that a man was coming who had questions about how things were going, and she'd told him in the same level voice she used for everything, and he'd looked at her for a moment, and then gone back to his drawing without reaction, which she chose to interpret as trust rather than indifference. Ritter asked Gideon direct questions and wrote down the answers without visible judgment. He asked about the ranch, the household, the arrangements, the daily schedule. He asked about what qualified Wren to be in her current position, and Gideon said she was employed as a household manager and companion, which was technically true even if it didn't cover most of what she actually did. Then Ritter looked at Wren and said, I'd like to speak with you privately for a few minutes, if that's all right. Gideon looked at her. She gave him a small nod. They sat in the kitchen. Ritter set his folder on the table but didn't open it. He looked at her in the direct way of a man who'd been doing this long enough to have stopped softening his approach. The complaint lodged with the board, he said, describes you as unqualified, of dubious character, and potentially taking advantage of a vulnerable family situation for financial gain. He said it without inflection. I'm going to ask you directly. Is any of that accurate? No, she said. You have no credentials in childcare or medicine. That's correct. How would you describe your qualifications? She'd prepared for this. She'd rehearsed several answers. What came out instead was simpler. I paid attention, she said, to what he needed rather than what I needed from him. I don't know if that's a qualification, but it's what I have. Ritter looked at her. Then he said, the person who lodged this complaint is not, in my experience, primarily motivated by concern for the child. Wren looked at him. No, she said, I don't think she is. That doesn't mean the concern is invalid, he said carefully. I have to evaluate the situation as I find it, regardless of the motivations behind why I was sent here. I understand, she said. I have something for you. She got up and got the notebook from her room. She brought it back and set it on the table in front of him. He opened it. He read for a while. She sat across from him and let him read. She didn't fill the silence. He went through the pages slowly, sometimes going back to an earlier entry, and she could tell from the way his eyes moved that he was looking for something specific, some inconsistency or performance, or the shape of someone trying to create a particular impression. He got to the entries near the back. He slowed down. October 23rd, he said. He approached the fence line on his own to watch Mercer work. Stayed for 30 minutes. When Mercer acknowledged him without stopping work, Elias put his hand on the top rail. He looked up. What does that mean? Without stopping work. Elias does better when he's being noticed incidentally rather than directly, she said. If you stop what you're doing to attend to him, it puts him at the center of the moment, and he feels the weight of expectation. If you keep doing what you're doing and simply acknowledge him, a nod, saying his name without adding a question to it, he can stay present. Ritter looked at her for a moment. You figured that out yourself? Over time, by watching what made him leave a room and what made him stay. He looked back at the notebook. He turned a few more pages, then stopped again. He was looking at the drawing Wren had tucked in, the one of the kitchen, the two of them. She'd included it because it was part of the record, because it was evidence not of her work, but of his. He drew this? Ritter said. Yes. When? October 19th. I wrote the date on the back. He turned it over, saw her handwriting, turned it back. She said carefully, He's not drawing what he can't do. He's drawing what he sees. He sees the kitchen. He sees us in it. He put the horse and rider in the background. That's his father at the corral. He's locating people, placing them in his world. Ritter sat with that. The complaint suggests he's deteriorating, he said. He's not. The complaint suggests the current arrangement is destabilizing. But the current arrangement is the first stable thing he's had since his mother died, she said, and let that sit. Because she'd been saying things carefully for 20 minutes, and this one she wanted to land without cushioning. Ritter closed the notebook. He set it on the table between them with a kind of deliberateness. I need to see him, he said. I don't need him to speak. I'm not expecting that, but I need to see how he is in the space. She nodded and went upstairs. She crouched at Elias's door the same way she always did. He was drawing again. He'd been drawing almost constantly since the letter came, which she'd put in the notebook as an observation without interpretation. The man is going to come in, she said. He just wants to see that you're all right. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to look at him. She paused. I'll be here. He looked at his paper. He set down the pencil. He turned in his chair so he was facing the door, which was the most direct action she'd seen from him in 4 weeks, and it cost her something she didn't have a name for. She brought Ritter up. He stood in the doorway. Elias looked at him, actually looked at him, straight on, which almost never happened with strangers, for about 3 seconds. Then he looked at Wren. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. He turned back to the paper and picked up the pencil. Ritter stayed in the doorway for maybe 2 minutes. Then he went back downstairs. Wren stayed until Elias had settled back into his drawing, and she saw that he'd started a new image. A figure, she thought, seen from behind, standing in a doorway. She left before he finished it. Downstairs, Ritter was with Gideon. He had his folder open now, making notes. He looked up when Wren came in. I'm going to be straightforward with you both, he said. The picture I was sent here expecting to find is not the picture I found. Whatever arrangement you've built here, it appears to be functioning. He paused. I'm going to recommend to the board that no further action is necessary at this time. I'll note that I found the child settled, engaged, and showing signs of positive development. Gideon's jaw worked. He said, "Thank you," in the careful voice of someone who doesn't trust the relief yet. That said, Ritter continued, and his voice changed slightly, not harder, but more careful. The concern on record will remain open. If there are further complaints, I or another representative may need to return. He looked at Wren. I'd continue keeping that record. I intend to, she said. He left. The buggy went down the drive and out through the gate, and Gideon stood on the porch watching it go until it was out of sight. When he came back in, Pete was in the kitchen. He'd been around the back of the house all morning, and she had strongly suspected he'd been listening for most of the visit, which she didn't object to because Pete had been at this ranch for 15 years, and his listening seemed to her a form of loyalty rather than intrusion. "Board man gone?" Pete said. "He's gone," Gideon said. Pete grunted. It was a satisfied sound. He poured himself coffee and took it back outside. Gideon sat down at the table. He looked at the notebook, still sitting where Ritter had left it. He looked at Wren. "That was you," he said. "That was the notebook," she said. "Same thing." She sat across from him. She could feel the release of the past 9 days in her shoulders, the particular physical weight of managed tension letting go. It wasn't clean. The record remained open. Margaret Hargrove was still in Millhaven with her connections and her certainty about what was best for people she'd barely looked at. This wasn't over. "He faced the door," Gideon said. When Ritter came up, he turned his chair around. "Yes." "He doesn't do that." His voice was careful in the specific way of someone handling something fragile. "With strangers. He faces away, turns his back, and lets them look at the back of his head like..." He stopped. "Like he's decided they're not worth his face." Wren said nothing. "He turned toward the door because he knew you were going to be there." She thought about the ribbon on her shelf, about the drawing of the kitchen, about the shoulder pressing, barely anything, against her arm when Margaret Hargrove stood in the living room talking about him like he wasn't present. "He knew I wasn't going anywhere," she said. Gideon looked at her with an expression that was not simple and did not become simple. It had things in it that were not ready to be said, and she could see him recognizing that and pulling back from the edge of them, the way a man who has lost things pulls back from wanting more things, the careful retreating of someone who has learned that hope is a particular kind of exposure. She understood it. She didn't push. She picked up the notebook and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and held Clara's ribbon between her fingers and thought about all the ways a person could be brave that had nothing to do with saying anything out loud, and about how sometimes the bravest thing was just turning your chair toward the door. The days after Ritter's visit settled into something that felt cautiously like normal. Not the performance of normal, not the held breath version they'd been running for 9 days before his arrival. Something slower and less deliberate, the kind of ordinary that accumulates without you deciding to have it. Wren kept her record. Gideon kept the fence line and the cattle and the 100 practical concerns of a working ranch. Elias kept drawing, and somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary days, things began to shift in ways that none of them had a name for yet. Elias started coming downstairs earlier, not dramatically earlier, 15 minutes, sometimes 20, but it was consistent, and it meant that when Wren came into the kitchen, there was already a small person at the table, pencil moving, and she would start the oatmeal, and he would draw, and neither of them would say anything, and the silence had stopped being the absence of something, and had started being its own thing, comfortable in the way that silences between people who understand each other can be comfortable. He started sitting closer at meals. This was the detail that caught her first because it was so incremental she almost missed it. When she'd arrived, he sat at the far end of the table, as far from everyone as the table's length permitted. Over the weeks, she'd watched him move, fraction by fraction, one chair closer, then another, until by early November he was sitting directly across from her, which put him at the center of the table rather than the edge. He didn't acknowledge that he'd moved. Nobody commented on it. But she wrote it in the notebook, and she noticed that Gideon noticed, and the specific quality of Gideon's noticing. The careful control of his expression, the way he'd become very interested in his coffee cup, told her that this small migration across a kitchen table meant more to him than he had the words for. One morning, Elias looked up from his oatmeal and looked directly at her, and she looked back, and they stayed that way for 3 full seconds before he looked back at his bowl. She told herself not to make too much of it. She told herself this constantly, because the temptation with Elias was to weight every small thing with significance, and the moment you started doing that, you started watching for the next thing, and watching changed the room's temperature, and a changed temperature drove him back. So she kept making oatmeal, and she kept not commenting, and she wrote it in the notebook at night, and she let the moments be what they were. What she didn't write in the notebook was what was happening with Gideon. She noticed it beginning around the second week after Ritter's visit, when the immediate tension of the county business had receded enough that they were no longer organizing themselves around a shared crisis. Crisis had been, she came to understand, the primary thing they'd had in common at first: the threat of Margaret Hargrove, the preparation for the investigator, the shared project of protecting Elias. Without it as the daily organizing principle, they were left with each other in a different kind of way. He started finding reasons to be in the kitchen. Not obviously, not in a way he would have acknowledged, but Gideon Mercer was a man who ran a working ranch, and who had, in the weeks she'd been there, spent the majority of his time doing exactly that, out at the fence line, in the barn, moving through the daily labor of a spread this size with the efficiency of someone who has been doing it since he was old enough to hold a tool. He didn't linger in the house. He came in for meals, occasionally for coffee, and otherwise the house was Wren's and Elias's territory. After Ritter left, he started coming in with questions, small questions, practical ones. Did she know what had happened to the extra jar of preserved apples he'd thought was in the back of the pantry? Where she'd put the spare lamp wicks after he'd told her where to find them? Whether she thought the well water had been tasting different lately, or whether that was just him. She answered them all plainly, and he would stand in the kitchen for a moment after getting the answer, and then remember something else he needed. She didn't say anything about it. She was aware that she could be misreading it. She was aware that she had been without certain things for 2 years, and that the human tendency was to find them where you most wanted them to be rather than where they actually were. She did not trust herself to be reading this clearly, but one evening he sat across from her while she was working on the notebook, and he didn't have a question. He just sat. He had his coffee, and he had a day's worth of tiredness on him, and he sat across from her and read something she didn't ask about. And they were in the same room, not working on a shared problem, just occupying the same space at the end of the day, and it was the most companionable she'd felt since Thomas. That scared her a little. She wrote something in the notebook and closed it and went to bed at a reasonable hour and told herself it was nothing particular. Elias left the drawing outside her door on a Wednesday night in the second week of November. She almost stepped on it in the dark when she came out before sunrise. She picked it up and took it inside to the lamp and looked at it for a long time. It was different from anything he'd drawn before. The earlier drawings had been observational, things he saw, people placed in spaces, the careful documentation of a boy who was processing the world through his pencil because he had no other available output. This one was not observational. This one was something else. It showed a woman standing in a field. The woman was small in the frame, not the main subject in the sense that the field went on behind her and above her, the sky taking up most of the upper portion of the page with the particular density of line that meant clouds or weather moving in. But the woman was the center of it anyway, because of how she was standing. She was standing the way you stood when you had decided to stay somewhere. Wren had no other words for it. It was a posture she recognized without being able to describe it precisely, the set of shoulders and the slight forward lean of someone who has planted their feet not against something but toward it. In the woman's hand was a small ribbon. She stood in the kitchen at 5 a.m. and held that drawing and felt something get very full in her chest and very quiet at the same time. She turned it over. She wrote on the back, November 12th, Elias, for Wren. She stays. She put it in the notebook. The morning it broke apart started out the same as every other morning. She came down. Elias was already at the table. She made oatmeal. Outside, the November sky was the pale gray of a day that couldn't decide whether to rain, and the wind had teeth in it when Pete opened the back door looking for Gideon at around 7. "He's in the east pasture," Wren said. "Something about the fence line again." Pete grunted. "Cutter's going to need him at the barn. One of the mares is favoring her left front." "I'll send him." Pete left and she turned back to the stove, and that was when she saw that Elias had gone still in the way. Not the bad way, just the listening way. Head tilted slightly, pencil stopped. "Everything's all right," she said, without turning around. A horse is hurt. Your father's going to look at her. He turned back to his paper. At 9, Gideon came in from the pasture with mud on his boots and a cut on the back of his hand that he was holding a rag to with more tolerance than she would have managed. He went straight to the barn. She wrapped the cut properly an hour later when he came back inside, and he sat still for it the way men sat still for things that required stillness, with visible effort and a complete inability to not watch what she was doing. "Stop looking at my hands," she said. "Your hands are doing something to my hand." "I know what I'm doing." "I'm aware," he said. "That's not why I'm watching." She tied off the bandage, and he looked at it and flexed his fingers. "How's the mare?" she asked. "She'll be all right. Stone bruise. A week's rest should do it." He looked at the hand. "Thank you." "It's nothing. You say that about everything you do." She looked up. He was looking at her with the direct look, the one he deployed rarely and which, when it appeared, had the quality of something he'd taken down from somewhere he didn't usually reach. There was something in it she'd been noticing for the past 2 weeks and choosing not to name. "Wren," he said. "Don't," she said. He stopped. She wasn't sure why she said it, or she was, and the reason was complicated. She looked at the bandage on his hand in the particular way the morning light came through the kitchen window and thought about the ribbon on her shelf and the drawing of the woman standing like she'd decided to stay. And she thought about Thomas, which she didn't always do and which sometimes arrived without warning. I'm not saying no," she said slowly. "I'm saying I don't know what I'm saying, and I'd rather not say anything until I do." He considered this. He nodded once. "All right," he said. She went back to the stove. He went somewhere else in the house. The morning continued. She thought afterward that she might have seen it coming if she'd been paying a different kind of attention. But she'd been paying attention to the wrong thing, to herself, to the complicated interior of what she felt and what it meant, and whether she was ready for any of it. And she'd stopped tracking the temperature of the house in the way she needed to. Gideon pulled back, slowly at first, then with more deliberateness. He went back to the pattern of before. In the house for meals. Out for everything else. The lingering in the kitchen stopped. The small questions stopped. He was not cold. He was precise and courteous, and everything a responsible employer should be. And every inch of that precision was a wall she'd watched him build in real time and couldn't figure out how to say anything about without making it worse. She understood what was happening. She'd seen it in herself enough to recognize it in someone else. He'd reached toward something and been told, gently, it had been gentle. She'd meant it gently. To wait. And a man who had learned that waiting meant losing had heard something different in that word. He'd heard no with a delay on it. She wanted to correct that. She wanted to sit down with him and say, "That's not what I meant. Let me say it again more clearly." But every time she moved toward that conversation, something in the way he was holding himself made her unsure of her footing, and she'd been uncertain enough lately that she kept waiting for a moment that felt more solid. The moment didn't come. What came instead was Margaret Hargrove. She arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after the bandage incident, and this time she didn't come alone or with the county welfare officer. She came with a man Wren didn't recognize and a letter that she held in front of her like a document of authority. Wren answered the door. Gideon was out. "I'd like to speak with Gideon," Margaret said. "He's at the south barn," Wren said. "I can send someone for him." "That would be fine." Margaret did not wait to be invited in. She walked past Wren into the hallway, which was either a power move or simply what she did, and the man with her, short, 50s, with the bearing of someone who delivered official news for a living, followed. "And you are?" Wren said to him. "Clement Fuller," he said. "County records." He did not offer his hand. Wren looked at the letter Margaret was holding. Margaret noticed her looking and did not offer to show it. Elias was upstairs. She'd heard him moving around up there about 20 minutes ago, which meant he was in his room, which meant she needed to keep whatever was about to happen as contained as possible. She sent Davy for Gideon, and she stood in the hallway and she waited. Gideon arrived in 10 minutes. He came in through the back, which meant he'd had a moment to see the buggy and compose himself, and he walked into the hallway with the flat expression of a man who was not going to give anything away until he understood what he was dealing with. "Margaret," he said. "Fuller." "Gideon." Margaret offered the letter. "This concerns the North Acreage, the 40-acre strip along the creek." He took the letter. He read it. Wren watched his face and saw the thing that moved through it. Not surprised, she thought. Something more like the grim recognition of something he'd been half expecting. "What's this about?" she asked. Gideon looked up from the letter. "North Acreage," he said. "There's a survey dispute. Has been for 15 years. My father settled it with the Hargrove family in writing in 1871. He looked at Margaret. "Which you know." "There are questions about the validity of that settlement," Margaret said. "The county recorder's office has opened a review." "Based on what?" Wren said. Margaret looked at her with the expression she reserved for people who weren't part of a conversation she was having. "Based on new documentation that has come to light." "What documentation?" "That's between Gideon and the recorder's office." Wren looked at Fuller. He was holding a folder. He was not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "How long has that acreage been in dispute?" she asked Gideon. 15 years, he said, "since my father was alive. The Hargroves have been pushing at it since before I took over the ranch. The creek runs through that strip. It's the water source for the east pasture." He was still looking at Margaret. "Without that water, the east pasture is not workable." Wren looked at Margaret's face and understood several things at once. The county board, Ritter's visit, which had not achieved what Margaret wanted, the complaint that had remained open, and now this, a different angle, not the child this time, but the land. Not Elias's placement, but the ranch's viability. Two fronts opened at different times, one after the other, because one woman had decided that Gideon Mercer's life needed to be made small enough that he would stop being able to make his own decisions. "When is the review?" Gideon said. 6 weeks, Fuller said. "The board meets December 18th. Margaret let the silence sit for a moment in the way of people who enjoy what silence costs others. Then she said, "I'm sorry it's come to this, Gideon. I genuinely am, but there are legal questions that have to be answered." "Get out of my house," he said. She didn't flinch. "We'll be in touch through the recorder's office." They left. Gideon stood in the hallway holding the letter, and Wren stood across from him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "I need to find my father's papers." "I'll help," she said. I know you don't need me to," she said. "I'm offering anyway." He looked at her. The wall was up. She could see it clearly now, the deliberate distance he'd been maintaining for 11 days. But something in what she'd just said made a small crack in it. Not enough to matter, but there. "They'd be in the study," he said. "My father kept records for everything. There should be the original survey, the settlement agreement, anything that went between our family and the Hargroves in writing." "Then let's find them," she said. The study had not been used in a long time. It was a small room off the back hallway, and it smelled of old paper and the particular mustiness of closed spaces in cold weather. There were shelves along 2 walls with ledgers and boxes, and the accumulated paper weight of 30 years of running land. A desk that had probably been cleared off by someone at some point, and then gradually reaccumulated everything that hadn't had anywhere else to go. They worked through it for 3 hours. Gideon knew how his father organized things, mostly, which helped. He moved through the shelves with purpose, pulling ledgers, setting others aside. Wren worked the desk, going through the drawers, the stacked papers, the folded documents tucked into books that she opened and scanned and set aside or handed to him. Elias appeared in the doorway about an hour in. Neither of them had heard him on the stairs. He stood in the doorframe, looking at the room, looking at the two of them moving through it. He had his pencil with him, which he usually did, kept it tucked behind his ear like some people kept a coin, a habit. "Hey," Wren said, without stopping what she was doing. "We're looking for some old papers. You can come in if you want." He didn't come in, but he stayed in the doorway. She went back to the desk drawer. Gideon, on the far side of the room, was carefully unsealing a ledger from somewhere in the late 1860s. The room was quiet, except for the sound of paper. Elias came in and sat on the floor inside the door. He didn't draw. He just sat there while they worked, and Wren thought about what Pete had said months ago. He used to get into everything. And she thought that maybe this was the new version of that, the version that fit the boy he'd become. Being in the room, being present for the things that mattered. An hour later, Gideon said, "Here." He was holding a folded document, heavier paper than the ledger pages, with the quality of something that had been drafted by someone who understood it needed to last. He unfolded it carefully. Wren came to stand next to him. The settlement agreement was dated March 14th, 1871. It was signed by Thomas Mercer, Gideon's father, and Harold Hargrove. It was countersigned by a notary in Millhaven and by 2 witnesses. The language was clear. The north acreage, inclusive of the creek boundary, was confirmed as Mercer property in exchange for a payment described in the document and acknowledged as received. "That's it," Wren said. "That's it," Gideon agreed. His voice was flat with relief. She looked at the signatures. She looked at the notary seal, still clear after 15 years. "Does the recorder's office have a copy of this?" "Should, but the originals always matter more." He refolded it carefully. "I need to take this to a lawyer in town, someone who isn't connected to the Hargroves." "Do you have one?" "I have a man I've used for ranch business. He's in Harlan, not Millhaven." "Good," she said. "Go soon. Don't wait for them to set the terms of this." He looked at her. The wall was still there, but it had shifted somehow over 3 hours of working in a small, dusty room. It wasn't down, but it was thinner. From the floor by the door, Elias made a sound. They both looked at him. It wasn't a word. It was a sound, low, short, somewhere between a note and a breath, the kind of thing that could have been involuntary, could have been nothing. But he was looking at the document in Gideon's hand, and his face had the particular focused quality that meant he'd been paying more attention to what was happening than either of them had realized. Gideon crouched down to his son's level, which he'd learned to do slowly and without making a point of it. "We found what we needed," he said. "It's going to be all right." Elias looked at his father. He looked at the paper. He looked at Wren. Then he put his pencil behind his ear and stood up and walked out of the room. Wren looked at Gideon. He was looking at the space where his son had been. "He understands more than we think," she said. "He always has," Gideon said. "I just spent 3 years not understanding that." He rode to Harlan 2 days later to see the lawyer. The house felt different when he was gone. Not bad different, just recalibrated. Smaller in some ways. Wren worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and in the middle of the afternoon, Elias came downstairs earlier than usual and came to where she was working in the kitchen and stood near her in the way he did sometimes, not asking for anything, just being nearby. She was reorganizing the provision shelf, which had needed doing for weeks. She kept working. "Your father's going to fix it," she said. "The land thing. He found the paper he needed." Elias picked up a jar from the counter and turned it in his hands. Apple butter, one of hers. "He's good at that," she said, "finding what he needs when it matters." She wasn't sure if she meant just the document. She wasn't sure she was only talking about Gideon. She put the last jar on the shelf and stepped back and looked at it. Organized, clear. She felt Elias come to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the particular warmth of a small person nearby. She looked down at him. He was looking at the shelf. Then he looked up at her with the direct look, the rarest one, the one he saved for things he meant, and held out the jar of apple butter. She took it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, very small, and went back to the table and picked up his pencil. She stood holding the jar for a moment. Then she put it back on the shelf, in the front, where it could be seen, and she went back to work. Gideon came home that evening with something different about him. She noticed it before he said anything, the way he moved through the door, the set of his shoulders. Not relief, not exactly. Something that had been tightly wound for a long time that had been permitted just slightly to loosen. "Lawson says we have a strong case," he said, putting his coat on the peg. "The settlement document is exactly what we need. He thinks the board won't pursue it once they see the original with the notary seal. Without that water source, the Hargroves gain nothing practical. This is about making things difficult, and a clean legal record makes that game too expensive to play. Good, she said. He came to the kitchen. He sat down. He looked at the table and then at her and then at the table again. Wren, he said. She waited. He stopped, started again. When you said wait, I heard something in it that I don't think you meant. She looked at him. Tell me what you heard. I heard that you were leaving the door open for me to walk away through, that you were being kind about it instead of playing. He pressed his thumb against the table edge, the same gesture he made when he was choosing words carefully. And I'd rather know a thing plainly than be protected from it, even if the thing is hard. That's not what I meant, she said. What did you mean? She thought about how to say it true. I meant that I've been on my own for 2 years and I've gotten used to the shape of that. And I wasn't sure whether what I was feeling was real or whether it was proximity and shared difficulty and the fact that She stopped. The fact that this place has started to feel like somewhere I belong. And I didn't want to say anything until I could tell the difference. He looked at her. Can you tell the difference now? She thought about the ribbon, the drawing of the woman who'd decided to stay. 3 hours in a dusty study and the sound Elias had made when he saw that they'd found what they needed. I think so, she said. Then what's the difference? It's real, she said. That's the difference. He was quiet for a moment. Not the pulling back quiet, a different kind. The kind that came before something. I've been pushing people away since Clara died, he said. You know that. I know you know that. He looked at her directly, the full direct look she'd seen maybe 3 times. I'm not pushing you away, but I don't know how to... He stopped. I've been managing everything alone for 3 years. I don't know how to stop doing that. You don't have to stop, she said. You just have to let me be in the same room when you do it. He looked at her for a long time. I can do that, he said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the evening was coming in fast, the way it did in November, and the last light through the window had the particular quality of late autumn, thin and honest and without any warmth to spare. She heard Elias on the stairs before she saw him. He came into the kitchen with a piece of paper in his hand, and he set it on the table between them and went back to the door. He didn't go upstairs. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen and looked at them. They both looked at the paper. It was the 2 of them, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, which was exactly where they were. He'd drawn it from somewhere slightly above, a bird's eye angle that shouldn't have worked and did. Gideon on one side, Wren on the other. Between them on the table he'd drawn the settlement document, still unfolded. In the corner, in this careful small letters he sometimes used when he wanted words, and didn't have another way to reach for them. Home. Gideon's breath went somewhere complicated. Wren looked at the drawing and then at Elias in the doorway and then at the drawing again. She thought about the first morning, the oatmeal, the pencil moving while her back was turned. She thought about the ribbon and the horse and the woman standing like she'd decided to stay. She thought, he's been telling us the whole time. Elias, Gideon said. His voice was careful in the way of someone being careful, because they had to be, because the alternative was falling apart in a kitchen. Come here. The boy crossed the kitchen. Gideon put his hand on his son's shoulder, gently, telegraphed well in advance the way he'd learned. Elias stood next to him and looked at the drawing on the table. He looked at Wren. She reached across the table and put her hand flat next to the drawing, not on it, just near it. He put 2 fingers on the back of her hand, just 2 fingers, just for a second. Then he picked up his pencil from the table where he'd set it and went back upstairs, and the kitchen held the 3 of them, 1 going, 2 staying, in the particular silence of a house that had started, without any of them quite deciding to let it, becoming a home. The drawing stayed on the kitchen table overnight. Neither of them moved it. Wren noticed it still there in the morning when she came down before anyone else, the paper slightly curled at one corner from the change in temperature between night and day. She smoothed the corner with her thumb and left it where it was and started the oatmeal. And when Elias came downstairs 20 minutes later and saw it still there, he didn't react, but he sat down in his usual chair and pulled his own paper toward him and started drawing, and she understood that its stain had been a test of some kind that neither of them had discussed aloud. She let it be. Gideon came down last, which was unusual. He was typically up with the light and out to the barn before she had the stove warm. He came in looking like he'd slept badly, which was different from his usual not sleeping well, which she'd gotten used to reading. This was something else. He got his coffee and stood at the window for a moment before he sat down, and he looked at the drawing on the table and something in his face went very quiet. "You left it," he said. "It belongs here," she said. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Then he looked at Elias, who was drawing and not appearing to listen, which meant he was listening completely. "Yeah," Gideon said. "It does." Bon. The days that followed had a different quality than anything that had come before them in the house. Not easier, exactly. Easier would be too clean a word for it. But something had been named the night before. Not by either of them. By a boy with a pencil who had been recording the truth of the household since before any of them had the language for it. And named things have a different weight than unnamed ones. You could put them down, pick them up deliberately, carry them in a way that didn't exhaust you. Gideon stopped building the wall back up every morning. She noticed it in the way he occupied the kitchen, the way he answered questions with a sentence instead of 3 words, the way he occasionally said something at dinner that wasn't about the ranch or the weather or the land dispute, something closer to what was actually in his head. He was not transformed. He was still a man of considerable silences and considerable walls, and she did not expect or want transformation. She'd spent enough time around people who tried to transform after loss and ended up becoming performance versions of who they wanted to be rather than who they actually were. What Gideon was doing was smaller than transformation and more durable. He was just, incrementally, opening doors he'd shut and letting some air in. She did the same. She was not unguarded by nature. She was warm. She was direct. She was capable of a kind of openness that came easily. But there was an inner room she'd sealed the day Thomas died, the room that held the particular vulnerability of needing someone, and she'd justified keeping it sealed for 2 years by telling herself she was being practical. What she came to understand in the days after the kitchen table and the drawing and the single word written in a child's hand was that practical had become a cover story. She'd been protecting herself the same way Elias protected himself, by removing from the room anything that could be taken away. She started letting herself need things, small things at first. She asked Gideon directly when she needed help rather than managing around the need. She told him when something was bothering her rather than absorbing it alone. These were not dramatic acts. Nobody would have noticed them from the outside. But she noticed them, and she thought Gideon noticed them too, because the way he responded to her asking for things was the way a man responded when he'd been waiting to be needed and had stopped believing the waiting would pay off. The letter from Lawson, the lawyer in Harlan, arrived on a Thursday in late November. Gideon read it at the kitchen table with Wren across from him and Elias in his usual chair. He read it once through quickly, then again more slowly, and then he set it down. "The recorder's office is dropping the review," he said. Wren set down her coffee. Lawson presented the original settlement document with the notary seal. He also presented an affidavit from the man who witnessed the signing in 1871. He's still alive in Harlan, 81 years old, and apparently very clear on what he signed and why. He pressed the letter flat against the table. Fuller told Lawson the board had no legal basis to proceed. The review is closed. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "And the North Acreage?" Wren asked. "Mercerland," he said. "Same as it's been for 15 years. Same as it was before that." She let out a breath she'd been holding, she realized, for 3 weeks. Elias looked up from his paper. He looked at Gideon, then at Wren. He turned his paper around and pushed it across the table toward his father. It was the creek. She recognized it from the description, a wide, shallow line cutting through the sketch, with the fence line on either side and the particular bend that Gideon had mentioned once in passing. On one bank, a tree, and under the tree, a small figure. On the other bank, another figure, taller. Between them the creek ran. He'd drawn it from memory. He'd never been shown the survey document, but he'd heard every word they'd said over the past 3 weeks, and he had put it down in his own language. and the small figure under the tree had something around its wrist. A ribbon, she thought, looped there, which was where she'd started wearing it when the shelf above her bed had started feeling too much like safekeeping and not enough like living. Gideon looked at the drawing for a long time. "That's our creek," he said. Elias picked up his pencil. Elias. Gideon's voice was different, lower, the way it went when something was getting close to the limit of what he could hold together. "You know what this land means, don't you?" The boy didn't look up, but the pencil stopped moving. "It's yours," Gideon said. "It was my father's, and now it's mine, and when I'm gone, it'll be yours. That's what I've been fighting for." He paused. "Not just the water, the thing of it, the fact that it stays." Elias looked up then. He looked at his father with the direct look, the one Wren had first seen in Ritter's visit, turned toward a stranger as an act of trust. He looked at Gideon with it now, and it was a different order of thing entirely. The look of a boy who had been listening for 3 years without being able to answer, and who was still listening, and who needed his father to know that. Gideon held the look. He didn't try to fill it or redirect it. He just held it, the way you held something you'd been searching for long enough that the finding of it made you very still. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over his son's hand, telegraphed slow, the way he'd learned, and Elias let him. Margaret Hargrove came to the market the following Tuesday. Wren had gone in with Pete for provisions and had set up a small table with the last of the autumn preserves. She'd made 4 new batches since coming to the ranch, proper quantities now with access to a real kitchen and a root cellar, and they sold better than anything she'd put out at this market before. She was in the middle of making change for a woman who'd bought 3 jars when she became aware of Margaret on the periphery, moving through the market with Cecily Dowd at her shoulder. She finished the transaction. She straightened her table. She waited. Margaret stopped in front of her. She looked at the jars. She looked at Wren. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had run a campaign and lost it, and had not yet decided how to wear that. "I understand the land matter has been resolved," Margaret said. "It has," Wren said, "and the board has no current concerns about the child." "Correct." Margaret looked at the jars again. Something moved in her face that was harder to read than her usual presentations. Something less managed, something that might have been genuine, which surprised Wren more than anything else the woman could have offered. "I do care about that boy," Margaret said. "Whatever you think of my methods." Wren looked at her. She took the measure of it the way she took the measure of things now. Not quickly, not with the first read, but carefully. And she believed it, actually. She believed that Margaret Hargrove had done everything she'd done from a place that had started, at some point, with actual concern. The problem with Margaret was not that she was cruel. The problem was that she'd confused knowing best with caring most, and had stopped being able to tell the difference between her judgment and her compassion. And by the time the two had fused together, they'd become something that functioned more like control than kindness. "I know you do," Wren said. Margaret looked at her, slightly wrong-footed by the directness of it. "He's doing well," Wren said. "He draws. He sits closer at meals than he used to. Last week he stood at the fence for 40 minutes watching his father work." She paused. "He's not fixed. That's not how it works. But he's present. He's here in a way he wasn't before. And that happened because his father didn't give up, and because nobody took him away from the place he knew." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Whatever she'd come to say or to perform had shifted. "The county record," she said finally. "The welfare complaint. I can speak to Ritter about having it formally closed." Wren looked at her. "I'd appreciate that," she said. Margaret nodded once, very tight, and moved on. Wren watched her go. She thought about what it cost a woman like that to say what she'd just said. Not a lot, probably, and not enough, but something. She thought about how most people who caused harm were not doing it from pure malice, but from the particular blindness that came from being too sure, and how that didn't excuse the harm but did complicate the satisfaction of winning against it. She sold 2 more jars before Pete was ready to go back. The cold came hard in December. The ranch pulled inward the way ranches did in winter. Work consolidated. the hands spending more time in the barn and less in the fields, mornings starting in the dark, and the light not lasting long enough on either end. The house held heat better than she'd expected. Someone, at some point, had done careful work on the walls and the window frames, and she thought it was probably Gideon's father, the same man who'd signed the settlement agreement in 1871 and built things to last. Elias moved through December differently than he'd moved through October or November. He was more present in the house now, by which she didn't mean visible. He had always been in the house, but present in it, engaged with what was happening in it. He would come and stand in the kitchen while she cooked, not drawing, just watching, and occasionally he would hand her something she was reaching for before she asked for it, which meant he'd been paying attention to what she did and in what order. She started talking to him while she worked, not waiting for responses, not directing the talk at him exactly, just talking about what she was doing the way you talked when you weren't alone. She told him about her aunt's recipe for apple cake, about the way her aunt had always burned the top slightly and claimed it was intentional because the char added depth. She told him about Thomas once, not the death, not the hard part, just a small story about the time Thomas had tried to fix the roof of their house and had come down with shingles in his hair and the specific offended look on his face that she'd never quite been able to stop laughing about. She told it the way you told a story about someone you'd loved and lost and had gotten to the other side of, with affection and with the particular freedom that came from no longer being in the worst of the grief. Elias listened. He always listened. One afternoon she was rolling out biscuit dough and she looked up and he was holding the ribbon. Her ribbon. The one she wore on her wrist now. She'd taken it off to work the dough and set it on the counter, and he'd picked it up and was turning it in his hands the way he'd turned the apple butter jar in October, carefully, with full attention. She kept rolling the dough. "Your mother wore it in her hair," she said. "Your father told me." He turned the ribbon. "She must have been a person who noticed beautiful things," Wren said. "Small ones. The kind people walk past." He looked up at her. "You notice things like that too," she said. "In your drawings. You put in the details other people leave out." She picked up the dough cutter. "That comes from somewhere." He set the ribbon back on the counter, beside where she was working, and he went back to the table and he drew for the rest of the afternoon. She didn't look at what he was drawing. She had learned to wait for what he chose to show her. He showed her that evening, before supper. He'd drawn his mother. She knew it was his mother because he'd put the ribbon in her hair, and because the woman in the drawing had a quality she couldn't name precisely, a quality of being looked at by someone who was trying to get every line right because the lines were all that was left. It was not a perfect drawing. It was the most skilled thing she'd seen him produce, and it was also clearly not finished and probably would never be finished because some things you kept returning to and never completed. In the background of the drawing, barely suggested, were the shapes of the kitchen, the stove, the window, two figures at the table. His mother was in the same space as them. Wren sat with the drawing for a long time before she handed it back. She didn't say much. She said, "She's beautiful." And she meant it. Not about the rendering, but about what the rendering contained. The love in the looking, the grief in the precision, the fact that a boy who hadn't spoken in 3 years had found a way to keep his mother in the room. Elias took the drawing back and held it against his chest for a moment. Then he put it with his others, face down in the careful stack he kept on the shelf in his room. It happened on the morning of the 18th of December, which was the day the county board was meant to have met about the land, though that meeting had been canceled when the review closed, and which turned out to be the kind of morning that arrived ordinary and didn't stay that way. Wren was at the stove. Gideon had gone to the barn early. Elias came downstairs at his usual time and sat at his usual chair and pulled his paper toward him, and the kitchen had its usual morning quality, the light just starting at the windows, the cold held at bay by the stove, the smell of coffee and the bread she'd put in yesterday still faintly in the air. She was thinking about the ribbon on her wrist. She was thinking about what Gideon had said to her 2 nights ago, standing in the hallway after Elias had gone to bed. Not a long speech. He wasn't a man for long speeches, but a few true sentences about what the months had been and what he hoped the next months might be, said with the careful honesty of someone who had learned that saying things plainly was harder and more important than saying them beautifully. She'd said some true sentences back. They'd stood in the hallway for a while after that, not doing anything about the things they'd said, just letting them exist in the air between them, which was its own kind of answer. She heard Gideon come in through the back, the particular rhythm of him pulling his boots off, the step that was slightly heavier on the right from an old injury she'd never asked about. He came into the kitchen. He stopped. She turned to see what he was looking at. Elias was standing at the near end of the kitchen table, not sitting, which was unusual. He was looking at his paper, which was on the table, but he wasn't drawing. He was holding the pencil in his hand and looking at the paper, and his mouth was moving, not making sound. Moving, like someone trying to remember how. Wren set down what she was holding. She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. Neither of them moved. Elias's mouth moved again. Something almost there, a shape, the beginning of a shape, the place where a sound lived before it became a sound. She had told herself 100 times not to hope for this specifically. She had told herself that the measure of the work was not this, that what mattered was the sitting closer and the ribbon and the drawing of the kitchen and 2 fingers on the back of her hand, that she had not come here to unlock a boy but to stay beside him. She had believed that. She still believed it. But she was only human, and she had loved this child in the way you loved someone whose pain you recognized, and she stood at the stove and she did not breathe. Gideon was at the door to the kitchen. He had not moved. His hand was still on the doorframe. Elias looked up at his father, and then, not loudly, not clearly even, the voice rough and unused and coming from somewhere it hadn't come from in 1,000 days, he said, "Papa." Gideon made a sound she had never heard from him. It came from somewhere underneath everything he'd built over 3 years, all the management and the reduction and the careful narrowing of his world to things that couldn't leave. It was not a word. It was what happened when a thing you had stopped letting yourself want arrived anyway. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he got down on his knees in front of his son, not crouching, properly kneeling, both knees on the floor. And he put his hands on the boy's shoulders with the telegraph slowness he'd learned, and Elias did not move away. And Gideon said, in the rough voice of a man who was holding himself together by the barest margin, "I'm here, I'm right here." Elias looked at him. Then he looked at Wren, still at the stove, still not breathing, still holding whatever she'd been holding. He said, "Don't let her go." 3 years of silence. 3 years of drawings and ribbons and 2 fingers on the back of a hand and sitting closer one chair at a time. 3 years of a boy recording everything he saw and felt in the only language available to him. And when the words finally came, they came not for himself, but outward. Not, "I'm here, but keep her here." Not about his own return, but about making sure the person who'd stayed beside him didn't leave. Wren set down whatever she was holding. She didn't remember later what it was. She crossed the kitchen and she crouched down on the other side of Elias, and she put her hand very gently on the back of his head, not pulling him anywhere, just there, just present, the same way she'd sat on the floor in October without asking for anything. He leaned, just slightly, just the smallest degree, into her hand. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Her voice was not steady. She didn't try to make it steady. "That's a promise." He looked at her with the direct look, the full one, and then he looked at his father, and then he did something she had not seen from him in all the months she'd been there. He smiled. Not a large smile. Not the wide, happy expression of a child with nothing complicated in him. A small, complicated, completely real smile. The kind that came from somewhere that had been closed for a long time and was just beginning to consider opening. Gideon made the sound again, the wordless one. He pulled his son into his arms carefully, and Elias let him, and they stayed like that in the middle of the kitchen floor, while Wren kept her hand where it was, and the stove ticked quietly behind them, and outside the December light was coming up slowly, the way winter light did, without promises. She thought about this later, not that day, which belonged to something too large for thinking, but in the weeks after, in the ordinary continuation of things. She thought about what she'd believed when she first crouched outside Elias's room with 2 fingers on the back of her hand and 2 years of managing alone behind her. She'd believed, or told herself she believed, that presence was enough, that the work was simply staying, that asking for nothing from someone who had nothing left to give was its own complete act. She'd been partly right. But what she came to understand, Sitting in the kitchen at night with her notebook, or walking the fence line with Gideon in the afternoons when the light lasted, or watching Elias at his drawings, was that presence was the beginning, not the whole of it. You could stay beside someone in silence and give them safety. But the thing that had finally reached Elias, the thing that had opened the door, was not her silence. It was her voice, telling him about potatoes at a market, about apple cake burned on top, about a man with shingles in his hair looking offended. The ordinary talk of a person who was not performing patience, but simply being there in all her ordinary human dimensions, tired sometimes, uncertain, not fixed herself, carrying the ribbon that had belonged to someone else's mother because a boy had trusted her with it. She thought, you can't reach people by becoming less than you are. You can only reach them by being all of what you are, right there beside them and waiting. She was not a healer, she was not trained, and she was not gifted with any particular extraordinary quality. She was a woman who had lost things and kept going and paid attention, and that had been, improbably, enough. Not because she was special, because she'd stayed. That was the lesson she kept coming back to, turning it over. Not that broken things could be fixed by the right person, but that people who had gone somewhere interior and silent had usually done so because the outside had become too painful. And what brought them back was not intervention, but accompaniment. Someone making the outside livable again, one morning at a time, one bowl of oatmeal, one matter-of-fact sentence about nothing in particular, until slowly the inside stopped being safer than the outside, and the person found their way back. Elias was finding his way back. He did not suddenly become a talkative child. He did not become a different child at all. He was the same boy who moved carefully and drew what he saw and kept his most important things face down until he decided you could be trusted with them. But he spoke. Gradually, in the weeks after December 18th, words began to appear in the spaces where he'd previously been silent. Partial sentences. Single words with the precision of someone who had decided that if speaking cost this much, it was going to say exactly what was meant. He said cold when the water in the trough had frozen and Wren wasn't dressed warmly enough. He said wrong once about a jar that had been put back in the wrong place on the shelf, which made her laugh, a genuine, sudden laugh, and he looked at her with the small, complicated smile again. He said good about the biscuits. He said show you to his father one afternoon and led him upstairs to look at a drawing. He said her name once, in February. She was in the side yard hanging washing, still cold enough that the sheets would come in stiff, and she heard him at the back door. Wren. Just her name, just that. He was holding her coat, which she'd left inside. She came and took it from him. Thank you, she said. He went back inside. She stood in the side yard with her coat in her hands and the cold wind off the fields and thought, there it is. There's the whole of it. The county welfare record was formally closed in January, which Ritter wrote to inform them of in a letter that was brief and professional, and which Gideon read and then set in the drawer with the settlement document. Both of them in the same drawer, the thing that threatened the land and the thing that threatened the family, both resolved, both filed. Margaret Hargrove did not become someone else. She remained who she was, moved through Millhaven with the same bearing, held the same certainties. But her certainty about the Mercer Ranch specifically had run out of room to operate, and she seemed, in the way of people who have been proven wrong without being able to admit it, to have quietly redirected her energy elsewhere. She did not come to the ranch again. Wren occasionally saw her at the market, and they exchanged the specific politeness of women who had said all the true things they were going to say to each other. Dora, who sold smoked sausages at the next table, said to Wren one Tuesday in March, I don't know what you did, but she's been off your case for months. I didn't do anything, Wren said. Dora looked at her with the expression of someone who had watched the whole arc from the Tuesday in October when Margaret had made her announcement to now, and who had the good sense not to argue, but the presence of mind to not quite believe it. How's the boy? Dora said. Good, Wren said, and meant it simply, without qualification. In April, Gideon built something. He didn't announce it. She noticed wood being measured and cut near the barn over the course of a week, and she asked Pete what it was, and Pete said something non-committal that she recognized as deliberate non-committance. And she let it go because she'd learned that some things needed room to be themselves before they were ready to be named. What he built was a bench. He put it under the oak tree at the edge of the south pasture. The one with the spread of shade wider than the tree seemed like it should be able to produce. It was a plain bench. He was not a fine carpenter, and he didn't pretend to be, and the bench was solid and level and completely without ornamentation, which suited it. He brought her out to see it on a Saturday afternoon in mid-April, the first afternoon that had the quality of actual spring rather than the tentative approximation that April sometimes ran for weeks before delivering. "I should have done this months ago," he said. "You've been working since before first light every day since October. You need somewhere to sit that isn't a workroom." She looked at the bench. She looked at the tree. She looked at the pasture extending out behind it, the green just coming back, the particular green of land after winter that was so alive it almost hurt. "Gideon," she said, "I know it's not—" he started. "It's perfect," she said. He looked at her sideways, a little uncertain, which was a version of him she'd come to find most reliable. Not the managed version, not the capable rancher, but the man underneath who built benches and didn't quite believe they were enough. "I haven't asked you properly," he said, "about staying, about what comes after." "You built me a bench," she said. "I think that's asking." He looked at the bench. "It's a bench." "It's a place to be," she said. "You made me a place to be. That's the whole question, isn't it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I need you to know that it's not just— I'm not asking because Elias needs someone. He does, but that's not why." "I know," she said. "I'm asking because this house is different with you in it. I'm different." He looked at the pasture. "I'd spent 3 years getting smaller, narrowing everything down to what couldn't leave. And then you came and I watched you sit on a kitchen floor for 20 minutes with my son, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought, that's what it looks like, to stay for real." She thought about the bench. She thought about the ribbon on her wrist and the notebook in her room and the small drawing with the word home in the corner in careful letters. She thought about what it meant that a boy who hadn't spoken in 3 years had used his first real sentence to tell his father not to let her go. She thought that Elias had understood something before either of the adults in the house had been willing to say it plainly, and that this was perhaps not so surprising. Children who had been forced to pay close attention to everything that was actually happening, who had no words to retreat into, often saw the truth of things with a precision that talking people managed to talk themselves past. She said, "When Thomas died, I told myself I was done needing things, that needing things was what made loss so bad. If you didn't need, you couldn't lose." She looked at the bench. "It took me 2 years to understand that's not surviving. It's just a longer way of being gone." He looked at her. "I need this," she said. "The bench and the ranch and Elias's drawings and whatever comes next with you. I need it the way you need water. Not as a luxury, but as the actual thing that keeps things growing." She turned and looked at him directly. "I'm staying." He reached out and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, this. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was the hand of a working rancher, rough and warm and direct, taking her hand in the afternoon light under an oak tree in April. She held it. After a while, from somewhere behind them, they heard footsteps in the grass. Elias came around the bench and looked at it with the evaluating expression of a boy assessing craftsmanship. He walked around it once. He pressed on it with both hands. He sat down on it, which resulted in the bench being completely sturdy and level, which seemed to be the test. He looked up at them both. "Good bench," he said. Gideon's laugh was real and sudden, and slightly broken at the edges and completely unguarded, the laugh of a man who had come a very long way to be standing in a field laughing at something his son had said. Wren felt it in her chest, that laugh, the warm, specific weight of it, the fact that it existed, that they were here. Elias looked pleased with himself, which was a look she planned to protect at all costs. She sat down on the bench next to him. After a moment, Gideon sat on the other side. The three of them sat under the oak tree in the April afternoon and didn't say much because they were people who had learned the value of silences that weren't empty. And this one was full of everything that had happened since October. The market, the kitchen floor, the notebook, the ribbon, the drawings stacked face down on a shelf until someone proved they could be trusted, the words that had finally come back. The bench that was a question answered in wood and work. Nobody fixed anyone here. That was the truth of it, and it was worth saying plainly. Wren had not fixed Elias. She had not rescued Gideon. She had not arrived at this ranch with some gift that the people inside it lacked and dispensed it. She had shown up with her own losses and her own closed rooms and her own habit of making herself smaller than the grief, and she had simply refused to leave. And in that refusal, something had been possible that hadn't been possible before. You couldn't always know which silences needed to be broken and which ones needed to be sat inside. You couldn't always know what a person needed or when they'd be ready. You could only stay and pay attention and speak plainly when speaking mattered and wait when waiting was what was asked of you. The bench held all three of them without complaint. The pasture spread out green and ongoing in front of them. The ribbon on Wren's wrist caught the light, the pale blue of a woman who had worn beautiful things and left a son who noticed them. And the son sat between the two people who had stayed beside him while he found his way back. And the afternoon was long and unhurried, and the ranch was quiet. In the way that living places were quiet, not empty, not waiting, but simply at rest, full of everything it contained,